Western nations impose economic sanctions after Russian forces cross into Ukraine on 3 fronts. Could the incursion escalate even further? Hello, I'm Arnold Nidal, and this is The Heat. Russia has launched what it called special military operations into Ukraine. The Ukrainians, for their part, vow to defend themselves against the Russian attack. Meanwhile, tens of thousands of people are desperately trying to flee to neighboring countries. Guy Henderson is in Kyiv and has the latest.
Well, after nightfall here in Kyiv, the distant thud of shells can still be heard across what is a fairly ghostly city now, because at 4:30 in the morning, Russian missiles rained down on parts of Kyiv. That, as the sun rose, led to people scrambling for their vehicles, grabbing what food, water, fuel they could get hold of, and hitting the road in their tens, maybe hundreds of thousands, to try and find safety outside of Kyiv. For a time, we were amongst that stream of civilian vehicles as it moved very slowly out of the Ukrainian capital to the west. But then, almost out of nowhere, a Russian military offensive began against a major Ukrainian military base in the northwest, to the northwest of Kyiv, about 10 kilometers up the road from where we stood. But what it meant is that the Ukrainian military then blocked the road. We then saw streams of Ukrainian tanks heading on to that military base to repel that Russian attack. And it meant that the road was entirely blocked for civilians for some time. So at that point, we turned back. But after nightfall here in Kyiv, there will be still many people, I'm sure, without necessarily having a plan, not necessarily knowing where to go, perhaps even still on that road, trying to find safety out of Kyiv. Because one thing is certain, so many people here in Kyiv really did not expect this city to be an immediate target. Guy Henderson, CGTN, Kyiv.
We have a lot to discuss. Let's bring in our panel. From Moscow, Dmitry Babich is a journalist and political analyst. Sergiy Kudelia is a URIS fellow at the University of Basel. He joins us from Basel in Switzerland. From New York, Lincoln Mitchell is an adjunct associate professor of political science at Columbia University. And Victor Gao is chair professor at Soochow University. He joins us from Beijing. Welcome to all of you. Dmitry Babich, let's start in Moscow. President Putin announced the Russian military operation in the early hours of Wednesday morning. It's a massive operation. Russia has opened 3 fronts into Ukraine. What kind of reaction are you seeing in Moscow now?
Well, I would say that almost no one is jubilant. People are concerned. People are very serious. People are very sad, because we view Ukrainians very positively. President Putin views them as the same people as Russians. Others maybe view Ukrainians as a fraternal nation, but no one in Russia wishes any ill will. We don't have any ill wishes for Ukrainians. So when this operation started, it was unexpected for us, because let me remind you that the Russian diplomats, obviously, they were not informed by President Putin. They kept saying that a large-scale operation was out of the question. They said that maybe Russia would support the Russian minority in the southeast of Ukraine, which has been fighting for 8 years after the revolution that took place in 2014. But very few people expected such a large-scale military operation. And we are all praying that as few people as possible die, and that it should all be over. But I would like to say that not only Russia is to blame for this situation, because the breach of law, the breach of the Ukrainian constitution started back in 2014, when the legally elected president was ousted, and suddenly Ukraine started to be ruled by people who were basically very hostile to Russia. and who tried to orient the country towards the West, almost exclusively towards the West. That was the beginning of the tragedy that we see unfolding now.
Dmitry, as you say, if Russians are sad at what is happening, if they're really concerned at what is happening, and as you pointed out, the Russians don't wish any harm on Ukrainians, how does one explain the president's decision then?
I think it's a very risky move, but probably the president thinks that we should have our new Cuban crisis moment. You know, Putin said in December, when he put his demands, Russia's demands, before NATO members, you know, with these demands, the Russian side said that if they are all not accepted, that Russia would give a military technical response. So everyone was thinking what kind of military technical response that could be, and now we see that President Putin decided to make Ukraine safe for Russia. Basically, the aim of the operation is to prevent the deployment of any NATO missiles or NATO troops on the territory of Ukraine, which, as you know, borders Russia. There's a huge border that Russia would not be able to control if Ukraine became a NATO member. So I think Putin decided to have his Cuban crisis here, because we all remember that after the Cuban crisis in 1962, both the United States and the Soviet Union started to treat each other with respect, and it became obvious that we would be adversaries, but there would be no nuclear war. So I think the same tactic may be used by Putin now to protect the country from NATO.
Okay. Sergiy Kudelia, of course, there's a big debate going on right now about where this is leading to, what this operation is going to mean. You posted an interesting tweet in which you lay out 5 possible goals, and those goals range from capture of territory in Ukraine, which could then be used as bargaining chips in negotiations if they were to take place later, to semi-permanent occupation of Ukraine. So talk to us about where you think this is going.
Well, it seems like it is going towards the capture of major regions in the southern, eastern, and northern parts of Ukraine. These regions, it seems like, would be controlled by proxies of the Russian government. There will be a fabricated set of elections or referenda that Putin may be planning to hold in these territories, just like according to the Crimean scenario, where people would be forced to vote for those individuals who would be supported by the Kremlin. I want to stress, I just heard the comments from your previous guest about the hostility of the Ukrainian elites to Russia. I have to remind you that we had 2 presidents over the last 8 years. And one of these presidents, current President Volodymyr Zelensky, actually defeated a more nationalist president in a free and fair election in 2019. And the current President Zelensky is a Russian speaker who had a lot of difficulty speaking Ukrainian at the time when he was running for president. And he is actually a very popular actor in Russia. Certainly made his reputation using the Russian entertainment industry. It is completely impossible to imagine that he would be hostile to Russia and to the Russians. All the key officials in Ukrainian government are Russian speakers. So the pretext under which Putin invaded Ukraine is completely fabricated. Right. And the goal of this invasion is primarily to capture additional territory for the sake of Putin's control.
Right, but Sergiy, one of the key issues that Russia, one of the key concerns, I should say, that Russia has expressed here is that Ukraine has expressed a desire to join NATO. And if that would happen, then Russia could see NATO missiles, United States missiles, right on its border.
Well, Ukraine expressed a desire to join NATO back in 2003 under President Kuchma. That has been the goal for the last 18 years. We are at this point nowhere nearer to the membership in NATO than we were in 2003. And NATO members and key leaders of these countries stated that explicitly multiple times. They are not interested in bringing Ukraine into NATO. So again, this whole fantasy that Ukraine at some point will become member of NATO is completely unsubstantiated. and cannot be viewed as the real reason for the invasion of Ukraine today.
So why doesn't Ukraine just say that?
Say what again?
Say that it will not become a member of NATO, that it will be neutral?
Because it is the right of the Ukrainian political leaders to express their desire to join whatever alliance they want. We are a sovereign nation, so that is why it's their prerogative to say these things.
Okay, Dmitry, you want to say something?
I think it's very important, the subject that Sergiy raised, and I think we both view what's going on as a tragedy. But I would like to specify that, yes, Mr. Zelensky is a Russian speaker initially, and he promised to bring peace. That's why he defeated Mr. Poroshenko, who basically first used the aviation and artillery against the so-called separatists in the southeast. But unfortunately, Mr. Zelensky did not deliver on his promises. In the last few months, the fighting in Donetsk and Lugansk regions was much worse than even under Poroshenko. And Mr. Zelensky imposed sanctions on the Hermitage Museum in St. Petersburg and on Moscow State University. So all contacts, all scientific, economic contacts between Russia and Ukraine were severed under Mr. Zelensky. As for Ukrainian membership in NATO, in 2008, NATO promised to make Ukraine a member, at some point in the future. And this problem became acute after the Maidan revolution in 2014, because the new government openly said that it was hostile to Russia, oriented towards the West. 1/4 of the seats in the new government was given to that extremely nationalist party, Svoboda. So, of course, Russia had a major concern about Ukrainian membership in NATO or about American missiles being deployed in Ukraine without Ukrainian membership in NATO. Mr. Poroshenko openly spoke about it.
All right. Lincoln Mitchell, let's look at the response here in Washington. President Biden has imposed more sanctions on Russia. These sanctions are mainly targeting financial institutions as well as some individuals in Russia as well. But you have written that President Biden's options are actually limited. I mean, one should remember that President Biden is also commander-in-chief of what is certainly the world's most powerful military and one of its most expensive. But you say his options are limited.
His options are limited because even though the United States has a very large and powerful military, Biden has said from the beginning of this episode that he is not going to put American troops in Ukraine. And I suspect that in the coming days and weeks, there will be pressure on him to do that. But Joe Biden's been around the foreign policy bloc long enough to know that that would be a dramatic mistake. A land war in Ukraine with Russia would be bad for both countries. Both countries would take casualties. And for all the tough-talking folks in the U.S. Senate, particularly on the right, who desperately want to make Biden look bad here, none of them want to go back to tell a mother in their district that their child died defending Kharkiv or with no disrespect to the people of Kharkiv. I've been there, they're great people, but that's the situation with the United States now. They can keep putting on tougher sanctions, but they don't have any other arrows in their quiver. And Putin knows that. And that is one reason why he's done what he did. I want to just address this NATO question very briefly. I know you didn't ask me, but this is important because as I believe Mr. Kudelia said, everyone knows Ukraine isn't getting into NATO. So to suggest that Putin chose to have this war because he was concerned that Ukraine was going to get into NATO and then encircle Russia is just it's not accurate. That doesn't mean Putin doesn't want Ukraine in NATO, but it's not getting in anyway. If we really want to understand the origins of this war on both sides, or from both perspectives, we have to put this NATO issue aside. That's a red herring. That's not really what's driving this. Why would Putin go to war to get something he already has? This war is going to be expensive for Russia. They will take casualties. And if, as been suggested, Russia is interested in taking and holding territory, that's not going to be easy. And I believe my colleague in Moscow pointed out the vibe on the ground in Russia is not jubilant, not happy about this war, or they're not excited, they're not enthused about it. And if Russia starts taking casualties, on the one hand, they may get more angry at Ukraine. On the other hand, they may look at their president and say, why did you get us into this mess? So Putin may have overplayed his hand a bit here.
Lincoln, one other thing, and that is, you know, as a former United States Defense Secretary once said, war is messy. This could go in any direction. I mean, is there a risk that this conflict could extend beyond Ukraine's borders and start embroiling countries that are actually members of NATO?
Well, there are a few risks here. That is certainly one of them, because as NATO begins to, move troops to its eastern border, and perhaps move even more than they already have, one stray missile, something like that, or there's a refugee crisis that throws a neighboring country into turmoil. There's a lot that can happen on that front, but there's another issue as well. When the world's attention, as the West's attention particularly, is increasingly going to be focused on this conflict, other powers in other parts of the world will look around and say, maybe this is the moment to attack our neighbor. Maybe this is the moment to recapture that territory. So this has the potential to spill over to other countries. It also has the potential to lead to conflicts or to make it easier to start conflicts in other parts of the world. And because of the effect it will have on the economy in Europe and also in North America, because of the role that Russian fossil fuels play in those economies, oil and natural gas and that kind of thing, it could make inflation worse, make supply chains problems worse, which would potentially destabilize countries in the West as well. So the ripple effects here, as you point out, are hard to know, but they could be very serious.
Well, let me go to Victor Gao in Beijing to talk to him about the possibility of the consequences of inflation going up for one, of there being supply chain problems. Victor, of course, China is very far from this zone, but it is a big power in the world. It's one of the biggest economies in the world right now. This conflict could have negative consequences for the entire world. How is Beijing viewing this?
Thank you very much for having me. China has very close strategic relations with Russia on the one hand, and China also has very close, very good relations with Ukraine. So this war, which surprised all of us and many countries in the world, is truly unfortunate. But I thought that probably President Putin had thought he had exhausted whatever options he had, because he is very much concerned about American missiles being stationed in Ukraine, which would constitute really a survival risk for Russia. Now, China and Russia have both pledged that they will oppose the continued expansion of NATO into countries like Ukraine. And this is very important because both Russia and China view the continued expansion of NATO into Ukraine, let's say, as not defensive in nature, but aggressive in nature. And in this respect, I think China is very much reminded of the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis. No one denied that the former Soviet Union and Cuba were both sovereign countries. They were fully able to make their own decisions. So why should the United States in 1962 under President Kennedy jump out? Why should they firmly oppose the Soviet deployment of missiles in Cuba? And why should President Kennedy be ranked one of the greatest presidents in the U.S. history? Because President Kennedy didn't buckle under pressure, and he eventually forced the former Soviet Union to withdraw missiles from Cuba. I think President Putin really looked at the Ukrainian crisis in a very similar light than compared with President Kennedy back in 1962. And countries who disregard his thinking and his sensitivity would be committing a huge mistake, because you are not there as a sovereign country or as a neighbor, as very much affiliated with Russia in terms of culture, history, you name it, to alienate a big power like Russia. And I think now that war is already starting, which is unfortunate, I just hope the war will be brought to an end as quickly as possible with minimum civilian casualties. And then Russia and Ukraine and all the other stakeholders will be back onto the negotiation table. Now, one thing is very clear from China's perspective. No NATO membership for Ukraine. That's a deal breaker for Russia. And I think eventually neutrality for Ukraine probably will be the best choice. China urges peace, de-escalation, and minimization of military operations, and all the civilian and humanitarian assistance possible. And I think China's position will be contributive to the eventual resolution of the Ukrainian crisis.
Victor, I think your comparison with the Cuban Missile Crisis is a valid one, but what about the argument that Ukraine is a sovereign state and can make its own decisions on whichever alliance it wants to join?
Thank you very much. This is a very important question. This is exactly why it is relevant to the Cuban Missile Crisis. No one denied that the former Soviet Union and Cuba were both sovereign countries in 1962. They were capable to make their own decisions. They were not talking about deploying missile in Florida. They were talking about deploying missile in Cuba. Why should the United States firmly object to that? And we now all agree that the United States and President Kennedy had a reason to be objecting to the deployment of Soviet missile in Cuba. This means that as a sovereign country, you are not enabled and qualified to do whatever you can, which may be perceived as constituting a survival challenge to your neighbor. And this is the very important thing between Russia and the Ukraine. I think Ukraine doing things which may be perceived by Moscow as challenging their history, challenging their civilization, denying the value of the Russian civilization, for example, and denying that both Russia and Ukraine fought together in the war against Nazi Germany, for example, then you provoke your neighbor in such a way that you are not going to get peace. You are going to get disasters. This is exactly the root cause of this war in Ukraine right now as we speak.
Dmitry Babich, one of President Putin's goals, he's told us, is what he termed the de-nazification of Ukraine. What does he mean by that?
Well, that's not a $1 million, but a $1 billion question. I would like to thank Professor Victor Gao for saying what he said, because he expressed very precisely the bitterness that a lot of Russians have about the attitude of Ukraine, or rather the attitude of the Ukrainian government, especially in the last 10 years. You know, if you read the Ukrainian press, if you read the textbooks at schools, Russia is presented there as a very negative historic force, some kind of a colonial power, which you know, hampered Ukraine's development, which was somehow connected to the Mongol empires of the East. You know, Russia is not a European country, even though we all know that Russia has made a huge contribution to European culture. Well, Ukraine did a huge contribution to European culture too, and certainly Ukraine is a European nation. But both Russia and Ukraine are East European nations. And of course, we have a lot more in common with each other than we have with Americans or with the British.
Right.
But you are right. One of the problems with this war is that President Putin did not set the precise goals. And this is very much unlike him. When we intervened in the war in Syria legally, on the invitation from the Syrian government, the goal was set very clearly: to defeat ISIS and to save Syria from being taken over by the terrorists. When Putin re-established constitutional order in Chechnya, again, the goal was very clear. We did not make Chechnya a Christian area. If you go to Chechnya now, it looks more Muslim than even some countries in the Middle East.
Right.
It's a very special Russian province now. So this time, it is not immediately clear how far do we want to go. What does it mean, denazification? Do we want to dismantle the government of Mr. Zelensky? If yes, then how are we going to set up the new government? Obviously, Putin would like Ukrainians themselves to elect some kind of a new government, which would be less anti-Russian and which would be more representative of various ethnic groups that exist in Ukraine. Right now, Russians are almost dismissed as an ethnic group existing in Ukraine, which is wrong. But you are right. The fact that goals are not clear, this makes this war even more dangerous.
Okay, Sergiy Kudelia, You know, a moment ago you were saying that it's a possibility that President Putin is looking at establishing proxy forces in these areas in Ukraine, perhaps conducting a referendum in the area as well. That would suggest that he's looking at a long, drawn-out operation in Ukraine. Yet he has told us that this is a limited military incursion.
Well, actually, he told in his speech, which I reread just before this program, that this is exactly what he intends to do. He is not going to occupy Ukraine, as he explained, but he is going to stage elections and referenda in the territories that would be allegedly liberated by the Russian forces, although nobody really invited these Russian forces to have them liberate Ukraine, and create these administrative units that would be governed by the collaborators or puppets of the Kremlin. And it is very telling that the guest from Russia had a lot of trouble explaining what denazification means, because there is no Nazi party in Ukraine, and the party that is in power right now is called...
There is a Nazi military unit called the Azov Battalion, which is part of the Ukraine National Guard, isn't it?
There is a very small minor force, a far-right group, which is problematic, but it has 1,000 people. And this is not the reason to attack Ukraine from multiple directions, to attack cities and bomb cities in different parts of Ukraine if you have a problem with 1,000 people of Azov Battalion who are staged in Donbass.
Okay, Lincoln Mitchell, unfortunately, I've only got a minute for this, but could this conflict have been avoided?
I want to spend this minute talking about this denazification issue.
Okay.
I'm like the president of Ukraine. I'm a Jew. I have family that came over from Ukraine, and like most Jews in the world, I lost family to the Holocaust years ago. The notion that Ukraine is a Nazi country that needs to be Nazified is abject nonsense. Yes, Ukrainians collaborated in Western Ukraine with the Nazis during the war. And yes, as in Russia and Ukraine, there is a deep history of anti-Semitism and anti-Jewish sentiment. But to suggest that Vladimir Putin is riding on a white horse to save Ukraine from the Nazis is complete, abject nonsense. And it's an insult to the memory of the people who did perish at the hands of the Nazis, including President Zelensky's family as well. And the short answer to your question is this absolutely could develop into a much larger war. And when that happens, we don't know where it will go. Yeah. And ultimately, Vladimir Putin's and the Russians' goal here is to destabilize and weaken Ukraine. But as this goes on, that could backfire, because if things go south in Ukraine for Russia, it could destabilize that country as well.
Okay, and unfortunately, we have to leave it there. We have run out of time. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching.